Good morning and welcome to the Southwest Public Policy Institute's live stream panel, Clear as Day, How Transparency Can Solve the Polarization Problem. I'm Patrick Brenner, founder and president of the Southwest Public Policy Institute. Our mission at SPPI is to improve the quality of life in the American Southwest by formulating, promoting, and defending sound public policy solutions based on the principles of free enterprise, personal responsibility, limited government, individual freedom, and traditional American values. We're dedicated to delivering better living through better policy. SPPI is a 501c3 nonprofit charitable organization. Contributions to the Institute are tax deductible. Our work is sponsored by viewers like you. You can help us keep these events free. We invite you to consider making a contribution at southwestpolicy.com/donate. The live chat will be monitored throughout our discussion. I invite you to ask any pertinent questions that you may have that we may direct to the panelists during the question and answer segment of the program. In an era of increasing polarization, we often lose the complexity of issues when we view them through our ideological lenses. Understanding the world around us requires us to take a deeper look at the nuances that capture the messiness of reality. History is often used to validate our current position, but the vastness of the past does not fit into the neat boundaries of anyone's present advocacy. Today, our panel aims to reveal that intellectual humility helps us understand the world around us, especially when we consider that the rich layers of history do not fit into any group's efforts to sanctify its political positions. Moderating the panel is D. Dowd Muska, Vice President of Research at the Southwest Public Policy Institute. Our panelists include Mr. Rafi Andonian. Mr. Andonian is the celebrity historian frequently on ABC, Fox, CBS, and NBC TV stations throughout the country, including an Emmy Award-winning appearance. Today, he leads a corporate program that uses live history programming for a more creative and engaging way to achieve diversity and leadership training. Mr. Jim Fluke. Mr. Fluke is the civilian historian for the 99th Air Base Wing under the United States Air Force. He authors an annual history, provides historical perspective and institutional memory to wing leadership, and manages archives of historical documentation. His research interests include the American Civil War, legal and constitutional history, air power, leadership, and decision-making. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm going to hand it off to Dowd. Dowd, take it away.
Thank you, Patrick, and what a pleasure to have our guest this morning at a time when so much of our public discourse is talking points and people just mouthing their tribalism. We've got two genuine historical experts here, and it's a great pleasure to talk to them. I'm going to try to keep my mouth from running too much, as tempting as it is, given the subject matter in terms of my thoughts. Broad themes of today's discussion: where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. Where we are historically in terms of polarization in our country, looking at the current era versus we've often had very fractious times in our country. It's not something that's entirely new, the polarization of today. What are the major drivers of today's polarization? How did we get to this point? And something of particular interest to me, how did Americans get their information about civics, about their government, about American history in the past versus how we get it today? And then finally, point three, what can we learn from history about maybe some ways to climb out of the fix that we are in terms of the polarization that seems to be getting more and more extreme? I'm going to kick things off with Rafi and then go to Jim. Where are we historically? I was just jotting down out of my own. I'm a amateur, not a professional historian, just jotting down out of my own archives, a different era in America, long before any of us were born, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Labor versus management, employer versus employee, the Tompkins Square Park riot, the Haymarket riot, the Homestead strike, the Latimer massacre, the Calumet Italian Hall fire, two events out here in the Southwest, the Ludlow massacre, the Bisbee deportation. Very fractious time in American history. We're talking not just yelling at each other, but actual violence, people being shot, people being beaten up. Obviously, the war between the states stands out as our bloodiest period of polarization, but it's not as if we haven't gone through these types of eras before and even after the 1860s. So give us some of that historical perspective.
I would say, actually, even from the very beginning of the country. So you look at, for example, the revolutionary era and the constitutional period. Remember, the Constitution is the form of government that we have in the United States, not the first. So it's kind of a second attempt, and really it's more than a second attempt because there are prior attempts before that to replace the Articles of Confederation, which is the first form of blueprint for government that we had in the United States. So while those are taking place, what that tells you with these multiple attempts is there's many different alliances, groups, ideologies, perspectives, platforms that are pulling and pushing and advocating and trying. In fact, the Federalist Papers themselves are sort of journalistic or advocacy that is being put into newspapers and journalism and pamphlets to help convince and persuade the American public and leadership to approve the Constitution. That tells you that there is division there. And then when you go to the Constitution, you have all kinds of different compromises that had to take place because of the fact that you have all these different groups. But then after that, in the early period from the late 1780s to, certainly to 1800, a very contested election, you have a ton of different factions that break out, two main ones, but there's all these kind of subtext to that. So I would say that, when you're referring to another era outside of the 1860s, that's what comes to mind in my mind is the debates around the worthiness of the Constitution, the interpretations of the Constitution, and then, of course, what's considered patriotic and at that time in line with the principles of the Republic. And so, it's really part of from the beginning of the country, we have these, a lot of, let's call it division, rumors, whispers, alliances, even betrayal. And then, but somehow, we made it through. And I would say there are eras where you have sort of ups and downs in the division versus consensus, but certainly these have been a part of the country since the very beginning, not just from the Civil War.
Sure. Jim, your take.
Yeah, so I'll echo a lot of what Rafi says, and I'll phrase it this way. Unity can hide the division in a way that when we're more aware of that division, makes us think that the division at one point didn't exist, right? And so the example that Rafi shared with us with the United States Constitution in the founding era, we use the term founding era. We use the term founding fathers. And we even kind of miss that plural piece to suggest that there was a single method or a single way, and this idea that everybody was working together towards the same thing. And that's really not the case, as Rafi illustrates for us. I think an example that may feel a little bit more recent is something I've been looking into a little bit recently. Think about the 1940s with World War II. We tend to look at World War II as greatest generation. It's a unifying moment. It's a clear, obvious, positive national good. Well, what's also happening at that same time? We still have segregated armed forces at that time. We have Black Americans who are being turned away from volunteering or told they can't do certain jobs. We have women who briefly break their way into flying, and they're still seen as civilians, and their flying isn't recognized for some 30 years. Those two things are kind of examples of that division that takes place even at the moment that we typically think is having great unity. So I think history can show us that those stories are a little bit more complex, and maybe we can kind of peel back a little bit of that false assurance that there were times of perfect unity and realize that there have been more contrasting views.
Yeah.
And Jim, I think if I can just add something there, Dowd, I think what's really valuable there to me is to say, okay, well, if we've been through these eras of different, polarization and/or, as you point out, Jim, maybe where it was hidden, some division was hidden or disagreement was hidden. How do we handle them in the past? And, how can we try to learn from that to handle them today? Not to say that all historical moments are identical. I think that's a little bit of a trap we fall into sometimes. There are differences in each era, and context matters, but there are also some things and themes you can learn from things in the past, and to have some sort of confidence, if you will, that we can make it through this too, and not be so pessimistic that, this era is unprecedented, so therefore the country is ending, and then that, when you start to think that way, it makes things more shrill. And that, I think, is one of the steps toward polarizing, because now everything is super, shrill. Everything is an existential crisis. But when you realize that it's not unprecedented, in that we've been through different versions of these disagreement, and we've made it through before, and we can find ways to make it through today within the context of what's specific, the contingencies of today versus moments in the past, then maybe that diffuses the situation a little bit, such that we can at least believe that we can find a way forward without an existential crisis.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're picking up on both of your points. I don't know what your particular ideologies are in terms of the size and role of government. I'm pretty old school, and I call myself an enlightenmentist, which is a term no one uses, but basically libertarian. For those of us on the libertarian side, it's very interesting because the debate over polarization affects us in a slightly different way. We're not very pleased with, say, the last 100 years of march toward bigger government, where there's been tremendous consensus in America, Republicans and Democrats alike, creating the entitlement state. Vietnam, there were only 2 United States senators who voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. We recently passed the 20-year anniversary of the decision to invade and occupy Iraq, which a lot of people over the years have changed their mind on. Our concern on the libertarian side, and not to undercut the point of this discussion, because I think it's an important discussion, and I think there are some very ugly things happening in our country. Our perspective is maybe we haven't had enough polarization on some of the decisions we've been making in America as we've been going down a path that's led us to a $31.5 trillion national debt and an unfunded liabilities commitment that is a little out of control. I would say it's so high we don't even know what the number is. But again, I'm rambling on my own points. In that vein, gents, we'll go with Jim. Interesting discussion about World War II. When have we, and I would say Vietnam, and I would say the entitlement, the creation of entitlements. When have we gone too far in the other direction in America, where we've been too unified? One of the things that fascinates me about the celebration of the greatest generation, I'm so glad, Jim, you brought this up. You have Tom Brokaw talking about this was the greatest generation in American history. And some of the cynics say, well, America was united at that time to incinerate cities and kill women and children in Germany and Japan. There was a downside to that. A lot of people suffered, being united behind an effort that led to a lot of suffering, not to defend those evil regimes that we were fighting. But it's always more complicated than we make it out to be. Have there been times in American history where we could have used a little more polarization? We'll start with Jim.
Yeah. So when are we too united? It's an interesting question, because I think the first knee-jerk thought is, well, can we really have too much unity if we're actually working together well? I think, and this is where we kind of introduce a concept that is related to history, memory. And memory comes into play because we often choose how exactly we want to think about the past. And so, kind of skipping back another century, we see memory a lot with the American Civil War and what happens afterwards. About 25 or so years after the Civil War, we start to see the building of a lot of monumentation from the veterans themselves, showing up on different battlefields. Gettysburg, of course, being one of those, which I know a little bit about, having worked there. And memory is interesting because memory is about a process of selection. We choose what pieces of history that we want to remember. And so I think sometimes we kind of create that sense of unity as we look back at our past. And I would say that can be an example where there's too much unity, because we're choosing a small slice of the story because we're comfortable with it, or we like that narrative, and then we move forward and we lose the rest of the complexity. I think we can see that in looking at the Founding Fathers. I think we can see that in looking at World War II. We can see it a little bit if we look at some of the early ideas of this idea of a war to end all wars, and the idea and concepts behind the League of Nations. there are a lot of different moments where we kind of choose from the past what we want our narrative forward to be like.
I think what's interesting there, Jim, is also that I love how you call memory a process of selection. When we look to the past, and to be clear, and I know Jim believes this, it's not just memory that you remember from your personal recollection, but memory is also cultural. So, for example, none of us here were around during the Civil War, but we still have some sort of memory of it that we have imprinted into ourselves through, representations in pop culture and rhetoric and all kinds of things, right? I mean, Gone with the Wind is still an influential thing. So, but so there's always a selection process, and that's going to be based on what's around you today, for better or worse. That's going to paint your lens, but you got to be aware of it. Now, I think, that the question is kind of interesting to me, because where my head went is, when it's a problem is when you have maybe group think, right? To take kind of a example or a notion from sort of organizational management. When you have group think is when you have a problem where you don't question these perspectives. So I would kind of modify what you said, Dowd, and say maybe it's not that we need more polarization, but maybe I would say, for lack of a better term, I know it's a little bit loaded term, but maybe more diversity. And I mean that in the truest sense of the word, which is these diverse perspectives that come to the table, so we can have more dialogue that pushes back and forth, again, without an existential crisis, that tries to come to a better solution. And understanding that, these things aren't always, there isn't always one right answer. You can kind of find the best solution in that situation. More information comes available. It's kind of always a process. I'm going to give you a historical example that came to mind is, well, for one, let me say this. You mentioned the incineration of Japan, or at least with the bombs. Remember, though, there was disagreement there, too. Even the scientists themselves from the Manhattan Project disagreed on how to use the bomb. Are we going to use it as a threat? Are we going to use it to bomb an island off the coast? So even there was disagreement. It's hard to find, entire consensus, I think, in history. But what came to my head maybe was the Cold War era, especially in the 50s and 60s, whether you're Democrat or Republican, there is this sort of consensus that everyone's a Cold Warrior. You think about Lyndon Johnson, certainly, his Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, the Great Society, this whole thing. And yet he's the same guy that, of course, we had the Vietnam War. He doesn't start it, but he certainly escalates it and kind of is seen as sort of the main propeller behind it. And that's totally a Cold War effort. Totally a Cold Warrior, and you could argue arguably the most liberal president we've had in American history. So the thing is that's interesting is that, again, these complexities are really interesting, but there's a consensus that you all have to have certain positions for the Cold War. Now, that's not to say that you had to love the Soviet Union. I understand. I mean, like my dad came out of a communist regime. But what I'm saying, though, is what the problem is when you have that overly consensus, let's say, is you sometimes don't think through things, right? And you might end up with a Vietnam, or sometimes you kind of are overly paranoid, or you throw the term around that this person's a communist, or that country, justifying, different actions. And that might lead to these dead ends where you lose the bigger picture and the bigger perspective, and asking, well, is this really helping us accomplish our objective, or are we just kind of like caught in this notion and fear? Think about the Red Scare, right? That takes place in the 1950s. All the things that take, there's actually a couple rounds of Red Scares, but those, I think, are examples where you can go too far, let's say, in consensus and not have enough diversity of opinion, while also agreeing that, hey, maybe we shouldn't be making friends with the Soviet Union, but we can have a more robust discussion at home.
It's funny you should mention that, Rafi, because I keep a list of, in terms of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's a very, very little known, but I've done the best I can to confirm all of these quotes. Not just the scientists who developed the bomb, but even the top military people had their own questions about this. I'm just calling up on my other machine here some of the quotes. Admiral Leahy, this barbarous weapon was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. Curtis LeMay, the atomic bomb had nothing to do with the end of the war at all. Hap Arnold, atomic bomb or no atomic bomb, the Japanese were already on the verge of collapse. These were major military figures, and they, either at the time or later on on had second thoughts about it. And again, more demonstration of how history is always much more complicated than we want it to be.
It is, and I'll just add something to that. Absolutely, and just I'll add a component that this is a great example of the layers of memory, in that case of the actors themselves, because they were there, especially after the fact. And Curtis LeMay, for example, it's personal for him, right? It's in his interest, because think about the bombing efforts that he was leading. So if you're saying that the atomic bomb is responsible for the end of the war, it kind of, diminishes his role, right? And so there's always these personal, reputations involved. I'm not saying that he's so cynical that that's how it is, but I think that, it plays a role, and you see this in the Civil War too. There's a big difference in letters that are written just days after the battle versus what the same participant, and certainly leadership and generals, 25, 30 years later, what they write in their recollections. And there's a lot of politicking going on of saving reputations, whose reputation is going to look better and not. And you see that on monumentation on the battlefield itself, not just in forums that they wrote into, various magazines and such, even in their own memoirs that they often knew was going to be published, but also in monumentation in a place like Gettysburg, where Jim and I have both worked. The placement of a monument was a huge deal in relation to where it is in the battle, because it had to do with our reputation as unit. So everyone has these interests involved. It doesn't make them bad people, and you're going to look at the world from your perspective. You know what I mean? So I think that is another layer we add in this when we look at firsthand accounts. We also have to ask, well, where are they coming from and why, and what's their interest in incentives? And incentives sometimes work overtly, and sometimes they work subtly.
Sure. We are flying through our hour. I want to move on to the issue of how Americans in the past discussed our history, our story, and the day-to-day politics and policy that was going on. I'll again inject myself into this. I come from southern New England, where 169 towns in the state of Connecticut, and at one time pretty much every town had their own newspaper. I was a big letter to the editor writer when I was in high school, writing about things that as a 17-year-old I had no business writing about, I'm sure. But it seems to me, from what I know, and even as we moved west, we didn't have tiny little towns compacted like that, but boy, people lived through that newspaper. It was such an important thing. Not only the engagement of ideas, the editorials and the letters to the editor going back and forth, but people turned out, this is kind of a cliche, you could, like the Bob Newhart show in the 1980s at the angry Vermont town meeting. I've literally been to a lot of those angry Connecticut town meetings. That was a real thing. And even to this day continues. We have in my hometown of East Windsor, Connecticut, we have fights over the budget every year, where the parents come out and they want more money for the public school system, and the greedy people like me come out and don't want the tax hike, don't want the mill rate raised on the property tax. But we'll start with Jim, and then we'll go to Rafi. We know how people get information today. It's very siloed. It's social media. You can literally click around and be sent only information that you agree with, only information that you're interested in. It was very different in the past. I think Americans, their civic engagement and their civic knowledge and their knowledge of American history was far vaster than it is today. I would humbly suggest, and I will leave that question open to the pros to debate that claim.
So,
Go ahead, Jim.
I'm going to push back just a little bit and offer a little bit of disagreement, and I'll kind of highlight the American Civil War era. And I had started down a dissertation path on and looking at popular constitutionalism. And so the idea of popular constitutionalism is, when are people expressing what the Constitution is or should be? And so in that, I don't want to be looking at courts and legislatures, but I want to get into a little bit more of those popular forums. So I did an awful lot of newspaper reading, looking especially at those opinion columns, kind of very sort of narrowly focused on Civil War time. And I think there are key differences between now and then, especially when it comes to the volume of media and it comes to the ability of the individual to select many, many different things. However, that said, I think if we do a close reading of those newspapers, we'll find that they're not necessarily forums for the exchange of all ideas. Civil War era newspapers were very partisan to the point that it's in the banner or the masthead. If you pick up the New York Times, you know that that's written by Henry James Raymond. You probably also know that he is the chair of the Republican Party and a big supporter behind Lincoln. If you pick up Chicago Times, Detroit Free Press, a couple of these major newspapers that are there, they are very much aligned with a philosophy, with a party. So I'll kind of push back a little bit and say that, yeah, I think there's some different levels of civic engagement in the past, because people are more in tune with that. But that challenge of, can we make the source selection errors where we go just to the one side? I think those have existed with us for a long time. So I think volume is different today, but it's not an entirely different situation.
I knew you were going to go there, Jim. Let me add to that and say that what comes to my mind is sort of the voting process. Now, the voting process in the late 18th and the early middle 19th century is absolutely wild compared to our standards. I mean, we talk about, voting security today. My goodness, we would not believe what we would see in the first 100 years or so of this country's history. Voter registration is not even really a thing, and secret ballots are not a thing, which means that people know who you're voting for, and that can lead to alliances, retribution, even, and social pressures, etc. Often you would have alcohol being served outside of the voting booth, which is how we got these no alcohol laws later on, to earn a vote. And these people were party people. Now, I'm going to get to the point on the media here in a second, because the way that's setting up is newspapers, certainly in the 19th century, are absolutely party arms of parties, and it's party people that are running it. And in fact, when you have the term party ticket, comes from the fact that you can get your ballot with the party ticket already on it. All the party members, is Democrat, Whig, Republican, whatever it is, depending exactly what era you're looking at, and take that from the newspaper, rip it out of the newspaper, and stuff it in the ballot box. Literally, also where the term "stuff the ballot box" comes from, because you can have multiple votes being stuffed in there. And because it's that simple to vote and people know what you're voting, if you show up to the voting booth, there are going to be party agents that are going to be outside there and that are going to try to bribe you for your vote with a job for your brother, a new pair of shoes for your kid, a shot of whiskey. I mean, this is the sort of thing that's taking place. And you want to talk about bubbles in media, my goodness, you know what I mean? And it's pretty incredible. And then you go to the late 19th century, in the era of William Randolph Hearst and so on, post-Civil War, in the industrial era and all that, the Gilded Age, William Randolph Hearst being one of the giants. Well, guess what? You have at that point what's called yellow journalism, which is sensationalist type headlines, which we still borrow from. And so sensation, so this idea of news not, being partisan, being a new thing, I don't think it is. I think where you're coming from, Dowd, I think the element of truth to that is that in the era when you had more concentrated mass media, when you had 3 or 4 television channels in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and you had this more concentration and this consolidation, that did change a little bit, I would say. That did change such that you don't have quite that ability to have the same bubbles. I think you did have bubbles in the 19th century because you decided what party newspapers you're consuming, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that's harder to do in the era of mass broadcast media, such as television, and the power of television, which influenced things many ways, including the civil rights movement successes that it had, and in this case, the media stories. Then when you come to sort of the last 20 years or so, rise of cable networks, as well as social media, as you point out, of course, the blowing up of the internet, you can subscribe to every which newsletter you want. And in that fragmentation, I think, is actually more in line with earlier American history. And so I would argue that the 50s, 60s, and 70s with that consolidated media is actually the sort of aberration from the larger pattern. So I would say that this is not new in that regard, even though it has new components. Now, one thing I'll give you for hope is unlike before. It is easier than ever before for you to seek out a different opinion because you're not just dependent on what local newspapers you have. It is easier at your fingertips to seek out all kinds of different resources and sources and perspectives. So in that regard, I think we have better opportunity than ever before to be less polarized.
That's an excellent point. I would just, when you were describing the ballot stuffing, it just recalled one of my favorite movies, one of my favorite Preston Sturges movies, The Great McGinty, 1940. Folks, if you should see all Preston Sturges' movies, but it's a look at maybe not so fictional, but maybe more nonfiction than fictional. Very enjoyable film. I'm glad you guys push back against me because I think all your points are really valid. I guess my perspective, just being raised again in that small town, my parents were extremely engaged in everything from zoning to voting to the town budget, and still are. They're both 80. My sister texted me yesterday. Our parents were going to a pro-life rally in Hartford, and we might have to bail them out if something ugly happens. So they're not giving up. I guess if maybe shifting from knowledge to engagement, I guess, is maybe where I'm coming from. People, there's a podcast I listen to every day, the comedian Adam Carolla, who has quite a time fighting the Hollywood left, including a lot of his buddies. He came up with Jimmy Kimmel, who's a complete gonzo progressive. But Adam makes a great point, which is people think that engagement today is retweeting something you see that you like. And he's made the argument a number of times. I agree. After 30 years in this world, I agree with him 100%. Retweeting something is not evidence that you care about an issue or that you're engaged in an issue. And I think that term slacktivism is a very descriptive one. Growing up in our household, I mean, it was a participatory. We were engaged on multiple levels, state, not as much federal, but certainly state, and then super hyper local, like those tiny little New England villages are. My concern is that people are confusing retweets and posting videos. One of the things I think that was kind of sad about Ashley Babbitt, you can think whatever you think about January 6th, but there were these videos online where she was very angry. She was posting these videos and extremely angry and yelling about various things, and had been militarized on that sort of MAGA issue. And I think a lot of that's going on, and people are confusing slacktivism for real engagement. Would we benefit more from having people really return to that public square more, instead of just tapping away on their laptop and thinking that they're making the country better? We'll go back to Jim.
Changed, and I'll share kind of a quick story behind that. Working at Gettysburg, one of the key spots there is the Soldiers National Cemetery. And you had this effort 4 months after the battle to honor the Union dead that have fallen on that field. And in that effort, a committee comes together and they bring out the foremost public speaker, right? And you be standing there in the cemetery and you have people who are on vacation and you're trying to explain to them, this momentous event. And you tell people that, this speaker spoke for 2.5 hours and he actually kind of curtailed the speech because he needed a bathroom, and he had written like a 3.5-hour speech. And I watched the faces of the audience, and there's almost sometimes even this like sheer horror. Stand here for 3.5 hours and listen to somebody talk. And I would tell them that if we want to understand it, think about listening to that speech the same way we would think about listening to, or not listening to, but watching a movie. And so I think where we're kind of going here is that entertainment has changed. And the forms of entertainment that we know today, they don't really start developing until the 20th century. And with changes in technology and devices, changes we've had in the past 20 years probably mirror the amount of change in the 100 years previous to that. It becomes easier to not engage. It is tough for us as historians to accurately go back and tell you how many people didn't engage in 1860 or 1820 or 1776? Because the truth is that not all of them did. But they don't necessarily leave documents that enables us to tell their stories. So there's that challenge. But I also think it gives a challenge to us. And then I'll throw this over to Rafi because this is a real big piece of what he's doing. When we talk about engagement, if we're going to talk about history, how are we doing that? Are we trying to do the 3.5 hour speech from 1860? Do we want to write a multi-volume 1,000-page book? Or do we kind of acknowledge the world we're in, and do we adjust our opportunities to engage using the media and using the technology that now exists?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I guess it's about relevance, right? It's about finding ways to be relevant in people's lives. And to show them that the insights, for example, in this case, history, there's plenty of great topics, that provide insights. But in this situation that we're talking about, history, that help them in their lives today, right? And I understand what you're saying, Dowd, about the problems with Twitter engagement or whatever engagement. But on the other hand, again, I see complexity. And to some extent, I agree with you. But I always try to think in multiple ways. And one of the ways to consider also is that it's an easier form of communication, and there are things that maybe one of the rallies that you were talking about, you can organize through that social media. It's a more democratized process, if you will, that can be very helpful, right? So in some ways, it gives more voice to people too. Depends on how it's used. So I think there's nuances to that, but there is value in being able to communicate through the mediums that make sense. Like, I mean, Jim reference, I'm often on TV, of course, and I have different ways I do it. But one of the ways I do it is these 5-minute TV segments, and I try to make it fun and engaging and not to audiences that already like history is our general networks. And so that's really valuable because that makes me try to find relevance to what's going on today to try to add some sort of perspective to that. And I think we had to kind of meet people where they're at. And sometimes that might mean being in mediums that, we don't perfectly prefer ourselves, but trying to find a way to craft what we want to get across within that medium so we can connect with audiences. Now, I will say that, one of the measures of engagement, of course, there's a million ways you could measure things, but one of the measures that people point to often is voter turnout. And in the 19th century, you have very high numbers of voter turnout in terms of eligible voters. You have anywhere from 60 to 85%, depending on exactly where you're looking in the election you're looking. And I would point a couple things. One, though, on the other hand, the universe of voters was much smaller. So we got to be a little bit careful when we say, hey, there was this huge engagement. Let's say if we're looking at voter turnout, yes, there was, but of course, that doesn't include women at some point at different points. It may or may not include Black voters or otherwise. So the universe is much smaller, right? So that may also contribute to it. So statistics are funny how you measure things. I would say, it seems like more recently, maybe one of the positives, the silver lining and all this, shrillness that we have around us is that it does seem like voter turnout and engagement has ticked up within my lifetime in more recent elections. And I think that engagement is good. I wish it was a little bit less polarized, of course. But I do think that more people paying attention on either side is good. I mean, whether I agree with you or disagree with you, of course, I have to acknowledge that you being engaged makes our process, our system of government better because your voice needs to be a part of it, regardless of whether or not I agree. And so I would point out that, if you're looking at voter turnout, which is one of the numbers I would look at, not the only one, in some ways, it seems like we're kind of bouncing up, and that's the silver lining in what's taking place today.
We're going to get to questions very, very soon, folks, and thank you for weighing in. They're starting to come in, but I'm going to try to maybe wrap up our discussion segment on an interesting email that was sent to me recently, a link regarding, and we haven't talked quite too much about transparency in government in terms of the modern sense of the word, but there are, and I ran across an article recently in my own archives over in the file cabinet over there in the New York Times in the 1990s, late 1990s, about the Clinton impeachment, in which Johnny Apple, the great Johnny Apple of the New York Times, was talking about. It was making an argument that everyone's playing for the cameras now in Congress and in the executive branch. And the old days when we had the smoke-filled rooms, when we had compromises had to be hammered out because so much went on behind the scenes, and that actually enabled a reduction in polarization. And the argument, and it's being made today, is that with C-SPAN, with politicians able to reach their constituents directly with social media, instead of trying to come together and hammer out a compromise in which maybe everyone is miserable that they didn't get exactly what they want, but sometimes that's the best for everyone, instead of some sort of extreme consensus, one side winning and taking over and leading us down a bad path. People are arguing that we have too much transparency in government, and that the old days, and we can go to historical references with our historians, decisions were made, compromises were broken because there was more collegiality behind the scenes at the senior leadership levels at state government and local government, and certainly on Capitol Hill. I'd be interested in your take on that, gentlemen. We'll start again with Jim.
Well, I'll say the 1850s really offers a contrast, because things really break down. When we talk about the coming of the Civil War, I think one of the things that is really important to keep in mind is that there is a system for compromising that across the 1850s is going to fail. And you take some of the old leaders of the Senate, Clay, Webster, Calhoun begins to change. And they will briefly be on the stage in the 1850s before they pass away. And behind them, we don't see party leaders in the mid to late 1850s coming forward with the idea of those types of relationships. We see a lot of the rise of the sectionalism, and we get to the point that the American government can't compromise, can't stave off, as it had done for some 80 years over the issue of slavery. So I definitely think there are many of those moments that we find we're not necessarily able to work together. I don't know that the absence of transparency helps. If there are those agreements that are worked behind the scenes, that also offers that same opportunity for a new critique, to look for, the secretism. Great example of that, Abraham Lincoln's response to the Dred Scott decision. He says, you see Roger, and he's referring to Roger Brooke Taney, who's Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he talks about Roger and James. James is James Buchanan, who's been president for less than a month when this decision comes out. Lincoln basically suggests, hey, they all worked together and created a conspiracy. So I think there can be that double-edged sword. I don't know that the brokering of the deals necessarily leads to greater unity in a bigger picture.
Rafi?
It's funny because, like anything else, history is about change over time. And sure, there are going to be ebbs and flows in how relationships behind the scenes change. But again, I would say there's nothing. I point to the founding period. Let me give you a couple examples. How about Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr? Literally get into a duel and someone dies. Okay. How about Thomas Jefferson? There's a couple stories involving Jefferson. For example, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson lose their friendship despite having gone through the revolution together, forged by fire, because Jefferson in Washington undermines Washington's administration from within, kind of seen as a traitor. And they lose their friendship. Washington dies with them not having mended that. In the case of John Adams, Jefferson and Adams, together in a revolution, of course, have a falling out in the election of 1800 and the years surrounding it, and then reconnect later because they were fortunate to live long enough to kind of have some distance from it. But I'm not so. There are these things called whisper campaigns in that period that would literally go around and have these rumors built around you, including Jefferson and Sally Hemings, by the way. That's not new. That was being discussed in rumors in the period, and not as a positive thing, as an attack on him. So these things, these personal attacks, again, nothing new. I think, there's something called the Congressional Globe. These are congressional records that come out later on in the 19th century. And these guys the people in government were very conscious of what went in there, and sometimes did things specifically for, what they knew was going to be reported in there, as well as their local town newspaper. So I look, scale is different. Every second thing is, be documented is different. I get it, but the notion is not a new notion. And you could kind of flip that around and say, well, it gives me less opportunity to manipulate the selective messaging that goes out there, right? So you can kind of look at that different ways and argue that in a different kind of way. So I think, as usual with things, I mean, there's some sort of balance that needs to be there. But I do think that it helps, no matter what era you're in, to humanize someone that's on the other side, or people on the other side, to understand where they're coming from. So you're more likely to at least even consider coming to some sort of, deal together. Because if you demonize the other side, it's a non sequitur. You're not even going to, associate or even have an opportunity to understand, let alone to work with each other.
Excellent. I'm just going to quickly reference our questioner, Harvey, who's not happy about my comment about transparency. Like one person has ever said we need less transparency in government, and that person is probably dead now. I hate to break it to you, Harvey, but if you email me at dmuska@southwestpolicy.com, I'll send you the link to the Congressional Research Institute, which has over 1,000 academic citations, how congressional transparency benefits lobbyists. So that actually is a pretty pervasive view among a fair number of people who are anti-transparency. Again, it's complicated. Our government is complicated, and I think that's the way the framers wanted it to be. For those of us on the libertarian side, we're not always... most of the time, we're actually pro-gridlock. We don't want to see a lot of things.
And can I just add something to that real quick? Is that yes, it is. If you have too efficient of a government, it's a lot easier to be usurped by a tyrant, which is one of the things that the founders are very concerned about. So having these inefficiencies, while at times frustrating, is not necessarily a bad thing, and is in line, I think, with how a lot of the founders, maybe not all. I mean, there's always different agreements, but I think that's a sort of a worldview that many of them have.
Yeah, excellent. We're going to shift over to questions for real now. This is a very interesting one as someone who's deals with public employees and public employee unions on a regular basis. And we can get into the historical. We can go back to Chester Arthur if we want to on this one. In the opinion of your guests, is the federal government, including all the agencies, departments, etc., more political now than it has been in the past? And of course, the civil service reform of the 19th and the early 20th century was designed to get the politics out of this. I think a lot of people, particularly opponents of the current administration, believe that the federal government is being weaponized from the Department of Justice to environmental agencies to sort of pursue an ideological agenda. So fire away on that. We'll start with Rafi again.
Well, I mean, it's always in how you want to measure it, right? I mean, the spoil system, as it's known, I mean, something that Andrew Jackson makes very famous, but, so it's been around. Is it more political? I mean, it's hard to say to some extent because the agencies are so different. The nature of the government is so different. I'm not sure there is such a thing as depoliticized government, because even if you have, staff people throughout, that are going to be the rank and file at the top, you're going to have leadership that's appointed. And naturally, much like in business, it's not different in government, you're going to kind of, hire from the circles that and people that have maybe helped you in the past, even if it's not a direct, I'm not talking about direct bribing here, but I'm talking about just a network, you know what I mean? So it's a mixed answer. I don't know if I have a straight answer, if it's more or less. I would just say it's not new. It depends on the situation, and maybe it's a case-by-case basis. But I don't think that will ever go away. So it's, to some extent, we're fighting a ghost, if that's what we're trying to do. So we have to understand that it's going to be there and see what level we're okay with.
Yeah, I'm with Rafi. Quite a bit of this really depends on definition and view. Yeah. The process is political, right? We do not have an interview board that evaluates who's the best candidate for mayor, governor, president, pick a race, right? We have a contest in which you have to get the most votes, and when you get the most votes, you have the power. So I think it makes sense that individual or sets of individuals are, trying to please those who have voted for them, trying to make sure they keep their votes, and there are appointments that come into that process as well. So I don't think that things are ever apolitical. I think perhaps more of a helpful framework is to kind of ask the question, how has that changed over time? And where it's changed over time is that as U.S. citizens, we have much more of an interaction with the federal government in our daily lives, more probably with our state and our local government than at times in the past. However, if you're somebody who is living in the middle of the 1800s and your party is lost, and the other party picks the town sheriff who happens to be your least favorite neighbor, I'm sure those political consequences are as real for you in that time as they might tend to be today if you have an intense dislike of one administration or the other. So I think there are relevant changes there, right? We do see, I think, greater power in different levels of government. We see much more of an interaction in the daily lives of individuals and the federal government than we do in the past. So I think that's a little bit better way to look at it rather than just is it political or apolitical.
Great. We are rapidly running out of time. I want to get to Charles's question, and this is something we haven't really addressed too much. And I'm a debunker of futurologists. I laugh at futurologists because they've gotten so many things wrong over the years. I wrote a column recently about how spectacularly wrong futurologists were. The U.S. Department of Agriculture said we were going to have cows in skyscrapers, and the facilities were going to be fed by nuclear reactors, and then helicopters were going to take the beef off to the processing plant. There's a wonderful picture in National Geographic of 1970. We're still waiting for those cattle in skyscrapers. We haven't quite had that yet. But making predictions about the future is difficult. Will the political scene get more and more divisive and polarizing moving forward? Now, I think we have historians with us today who are much more qualified because they look back so much farther than the rest of us sometimes who can't even remember what happened last week. So we'll start again with Jim. What's your inkling? Not your prediction, but just where do you think this is trending? Informed by your historical knowledge, where are we trending, and where can maybe we get an off ramp if an opportunity opens up to maybe make things a little more rational in our country and maybe have a little less shooting, screaming, and buildings being burned down, which I think we all can agree is a very bad thing.
So we'll give the great cheater answer. It depends. I can't tell you if we're going to get more or less polarized. I don't know if there's much value in assessing whether we are at the most polarized point in time or not. But hopefully the past can tell us maybe a little bit of where not to go. And so there's a great 19th century historian by the name of Michael Holt, who writes what I think is an amazing book called The Political Crisis of the 1850s. And he really looks at this concept of the politics of fear. And we are all perfectly familiar with the politics of fear. It takes right back to a comment that Rafi made earlier. If you demonize somebody, it's really hard to work with them. And I think what we find, and we can, I don't want to dive too deep into psychology because it's not my expertise, But fear is a very strong motivator. And we have to, I think, if we're going to start to, where's that off ramp? We have to figure out how to get away from motivation by fear. It's very easy to make people angry and then say, okay, let's act, let's go do something. You know, the fear here, that is so bad, and that is so bad that it now justifies me doing something that I wouldn't normally do. So if we're looking for that off ramp, avoid the politics of fear. And you know, for me, that starts with me. I got to look in the mirror. You know, I've got some strong views and opinions, and I've got to look in the mirror and say, okay, don't fall into a politics of fear. Go read something you dislike reading, but read it so you understand some other views. Go have conversations with people that you know are different. So I think get away from that politics of fear. That's our off-ramp opportunity.
Excellent.
And I just want to add something is that, you know, I think Jim said it very well. I mean, seeking out alternative opinions is very, and like I said earlier, is very, and be fair. Don't go to the trashiest opinion you can find on some other side. Find some actual, you know, quality sort of source, and you can tell the difference between what's being, you know, articulate and what's not. But also there are, like, you know, other sources, like you can go to National Archives or something like that, a Library of Congress, and like that's not even news sources per se, and poke around on there, and often just that kind of material is going to, you know, sort of help you see different perspectives, you're exposed to things. But one comment I want to make on this politicized thing, which is how we kind of went down this path, is not necessarily a bad thing, guys, because that's how you build coalitions. When you know, I was just reading something about the 1912 presidential election, Democratic primary. The primaries weren't exactly like we have today, but they were at the convention, and basically different candidate supporters. One of them does not have a majority, so they keep taking votes and votes and votes, and there's like 40-something votes that they take until finally one of the candidates gives up their electors or convinces their electors to vote for Woodrow Wilson, who ends up being the nominee. And that to me is not a bad thing. But cutting a deal like that, even with opponents, even though despite the promises that they had made, they broke a promise and broke. And the point there is that actually helps build a coalition. That's how the parties have evolved platforms over time, by scooping up a group that they didn't previously include or take as serious. And that builds the tent, that builds the coalition. So having that sort of expectation of, hey, if you help me get somewhere, I'm going to give gratitude and give you something back, is not a bad thing. There is a scale of what's cronyism versus what's gratitude. I mean, that's a gray area you could discuss. But the point is, it's not an all or nothing game. And building coalitions makes it so that you all have stakes in common objectives, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So we have to kind of reserve judgment and try to understand and analyze the situation.
Out of time. Rafi and Jim, thank you for your perspective. It's a joy. I stopped watching cable news 20 years ago. I actually like to consult experts who know what their subjects are. And it's a joy to have you two gentlemen with us. And folks, we're going to be doing more of these events moving forward with people who actually know what they're talking about, or not just screaming into a microphone here at the Southwest Public Policy Institute. Visit us at southwestpolicy.com and let us know. And of course, we will hook you up with a video of this, and we'll link to the work of these two gentlemen. Folks, thanks for joining us. Rafi, Jim, a very, very enlightening hour. And we're going to do this again sometime. Thanks so much.
Thanks for the opportunity to join.